Great, Lloyd. Lloyd, thank you very much for that introduction, and lovely to have such a wonderful turnout. Difficult to get people for a talk indoors on a day like this. But I'd like to talk a little bit of a difference around history. When we talk about history, and I cannot fully do justice in 15 minutes or so to allow time for questions, to do justice to a history of whaling. But what I'd like to talk about is really whales in Algoa Bay yesterday, today, and tomorrow. History is not only about yesterday, but it's also got a lot to do about tomorrow, and it's about today as well. So with that, I'm talking on behalf of the Historical Society of Port Elizabeth. I'm the chairman of that particular society. I'll briefly look at three aspects within this 15 minutes. The first is really the yesterday in terms of what happened before the 19th century, i.e. 1800 and previously. Today, what happened in the 1900s, what Lloyd talked about, this bounce back aspect, and really tomorrow, about what needs to happen and what is happening in the future. I think just a little bit of a word first around the Historical Society of PE. We've had a lot of press over the years. We've been around since 1959. Many of the heritage features around the city have been primarily established as a result of the interventions of volunteers, people like Eleanor Clayton Holliday. There's a whole range of individuals who made tremendous contributions. So that's just the press. In terms of the yesterday, i.e. the early records, what happened in the 19th century, and essentially the killing fields of the 19th century, because that's really what happened. Prior to the colonialization period from 1652 onwards, the historical record has actually got lots of evidence of indigenous local people utilizing whales who mostly stranded on our shores. The potsherds of the early Khoisan, the whale fat was mixed with ochre as a body covering, and up to 9.3, it's been estimated that about 9.3% of the coastal diets of the early Khoisan actually came from whale strandings. A lot of the early explorers along these coastlines as well, not explorers, people who got shipwrecked along the way, as part of that shipwreck to survive along this coastline, they emulated the use of this whale stranding by the local people to actually survive, Stavanisa, Grosvenor being examples of that. So there's a lot of historical and archaeological work that has been done to show that this resource has been used over the centuries for survival. Some facts around the whaling in Algoa Bay, and like I said, it's nearly impossible to talk about it, but to give it justice in such a short time. But on the top left, there's a photograph there, or painting, shall I say. It was done by Robert Gordon around about 1773. And if you see the little signs, the A and the B, it was actually an instruction to the early sailors about how to kill this baleen or southern right whale. So from a very early stage along these coastlines, people were targeting the whale. And the early from about the 1820 settlers, there were whaling stations established here. Frederick Corsten, one of the founders of the city from about 1819, established these facilities along the coastline. The one was at Deal Party, and Corsten established a facility at where the Red Windmill is today. a large number of whales, and there's a couple of graphics that you need to just look at. That's a 1833 painting where Huggins, I believe it is, painted some of the scenes within Algoa Bay around about 1820. And there was a large number of whales coming to calve within Algoa Bay at the time. The whale bones, obviously the blubber was used for whale oil. That's a drum that's still currently on St. Croix Island. That's a picture of Lloyd's. And then obviously before the use of plastics that they talked about with Sustainable Seas Trust, whalebone was used for everything from women's corsets to umbrellas to shoehorns, you name it. It was fairly widespread usage. There were some tremendous characters around Algoa Bay as well. I mean, you know, a lot of them were non or coloured. Some of them, for instance, were shipwrecked sailors, like, for instance, Fernandez. And people such as James Sewell came along as recently as the late 1870s to try and establish whale industries. And he's generally known as the father of the PE docks. So what Searle also recognized and what it said in the records, and a lot of what I'm talking about is within the looking back journals of the Historical Society, that the point is made that the killing or the harvesting of the oil was taken away from St. Croix to North End, ostensibly because all the oil going into the ocean was killing the penguins. Whether that's a fact or not, but whether it was just the sea conditions which prevented it is somewhat open to debate. If we move on to some of the economics, and this is where it really gets interesting. The economics are very clear, is that in 1897, the value of that one whale that was killed was worth 6 million rand. So at the time, so that's what went around amongst these whalers. And in terms of the numbers of whales killed along the South African coastline in these bays, which were actually providing shelter for whales to actually reproduce, there were only about 1,600 killed over that 137 years. By comparison, over a similar period in the southern seas, we had about 38,000 killed. Now, what are the reasons in terms of why that low number? So if we go back on the historical record, and on the top right-hand side, what you'll see there is the number of whales killed within Algoa Bay. And it's only about 152 over that period from 1819 to 1841. The fact of the matter is that the whale populations were being decimated, and the whales that were being killed within Algoa Bay was actually a very small number, and it was highly opportunistic but highly lucrative. In today's terms, a live whale is actually worth 39 million rand. That is what the science is saying. So there's far more value within a live whale as opposed to a dead whale. This map over here on the right-hand side tells us more or less what was going on. And it's important to draw a parallel between Nantucket and Algoa Bay. By the early 1800s, Nantucket was known as the whale capital of the world. And these whaling vessels, having decimated the whaling populations in the northern hemisphere, started heading south. And heading in the southern seas, this is a map from around 1860, and the R means southern right whale, and the S means the sperm whale. And essentially, the whales were being killed in the southern seas, and the numbers were going down within Algoa Bay, to the extent by the early 1900s, they weren't coming to Algoa Bay at all. So what does this mean for the 20th century? By the 20th century, as far back as 1842, one of the early pioneers to Algoa Bay, Chase, indicated that there were up to about 100 American vessels in the southern seas all harvesting these whales. And so it completely changed the distribution of whales. With the banning of whaling in the 20th century, by 1988, we'd already seen a 7% increase per annum along the Eastern Cape Coast. So we saw this ticking up. By 2002, the impacts were already amazing, just by stopping the hunting of the whales. And we were seeing this amazing bounce back. So what does all this mean for whales in Algoa Bay in terms of the yesterday, today, and tomorrow? The first point is that we've got lots of models, we have lots of legislation, we've got policy, we've got all sorts of fancy catchphrases. But the fact of the matter where we are falling short is in the implementation. Here in Algoa Bay, there are numerous implementation challenges that we are faced with. The species is bouncing back, but the real threats are coming from us, the anthropogenic impacts, and those real challenges, many of them are land-based. Since I was a youngster, we've been talking about the tank farm being moved from the PE port. 20 years later, it still hasn't been moved. Those marine pollutants are still coming out there, and it's affecting the quality of our port. The manganese has been promised to be moved for the past 30 years. We still sit in a situation where that manganese is now on the roads. And you may ask, how does that affect the marine environment? Of course it's affecting the marine environment. Part of that, if you look at the sheer number of vessels within Algoa Bay, the number of vessels of manganese carrying manganese load can be significantly introduced just by improving the port efficiencies within Algoa Bay. There's a significant increase in marine traffic in Algoa Bay, which represents a fundamental challenge to the whale populations which are bouncing back. The bunkering, I think a lot is going to be said today around bunkering and the impacts of that. If you're going to have bunkering within a marine environment like we have at the moment, it's absolutely no question. You've got to have the necessary checks and balances in place. The fact of the matter is that our oil spill contingencies, our ability to respond to threats, we've seen plummeting of penguin populations, which we don't fully understand at the moment. But underlying all of this are port inefficiencies which are impacting on Algoa Bay. It's well known that the two ports, Port Elizabeth and Port of Ngqura, are amongst the most inefficient ports in the world. You cannot move towards environmental sustainability and healthy marine populations in Algoa Bay until you start looking at these holistically, removing these ports' inefficiencies. And then it really comes down to the basics, the absolute basics. Where we get our water, where we get our electricity, where does our sewage go? All of that relates to a livable city. And we are fast moving towards a situation where we have an unlivable city. It's completely wrong. The whaling capital of the world in Nantucket collapsed in 1860. Today, that is the leading tourist population or venue, one of the biggest in the world. It's completely overwhelmed with tourism during the summer season, and much is around the history of whaling in Nantucket. That whaling industry is dead there, their tourism industry is alive. They're taking the 39 million, and we still messing around here, not even getting the 6. So, in concluding, I think it's very, very simple. We find that we tend to be overwhelmed by all the inefficiencies within the South African economy at the moment. It's actually incredibly easy to fix. To fix the health of Algoa Bay, we've got to fix the basics, i.e. the energy, bringing on that extra 6 gigawatts so we don't have load shedding, so we can run our pump stations properly to ensure that the marine pollutants are not going into Algoa Bay. This is not rocket science, and it can be done without importing car ships and so forth. The same with respect to water. The drought that we're in, the way in which we use water, are all aspects which we can solve. Our sewer pump stations, our sewer systems are incredibly old, badly maintained. We're doing a lot better than many of the other cities, but we can do so much more. The bay really starts in the mountains. We live in a city where we're surrounded by the mountains. The impacts on the bay start there, and it's really all up to all of us to start doing something about that. And I think the fundamental issue is really action by individual citizens. Everyone has got a role to play to try and make this a more efficient economy. So that's about it from my side. And thank you very much for the opportunity to the Whale Festival to talk here a little bit about history. You're welcome. We've got a bag, yes, for some of our old journals. The Historical Society maintains a website on historicalsocietype.co.za. Our journals and our publications dating back to 1959 are all there. So you're welcome to contact us directly to get any of those publications. Thank you very much. And thank you.